Next, we want to cover some of California's economic geography. And economic geography is a subset of human or cultural geography having to do with the distribution or spatial organization of economic activity. And when we look at economic geography, what we often do is divide it into different economic sectors, including the primary sector, which has to do with harvesting of commodities from nature, agriculture, fishing, mining, and so on. Secondary, which is manufacturing of goods, like working in a factory, and tertiary, which is part of the service economy, and so on. And this sort of little figure here helps to kind of illustrate that. The idea is that the primary sector is the types of jobs that are dealing directly with harvesting things from nature, forestry, fishing, and agriculture. And then a step above that is processing those goods, canning tomatoes, building a Honda, and so on. And then above that is the tertiary sector, where actually most people in North America work in the tertiary sector, or the service part of the economy. However, for this lecture, we want to focus on primary industries, the harvesting and using commodities from nature. And that's what we're going to focus on first, and then later we're going to move on to other levels of industry. Okay, so primary industries include things like agriculture. Agriculture is the big one for California, but there's other primary industries as well: fishing, forestry, mining, energy, and even ecotourism we can include with that as well. Ecotourism kind of falls within two fields. It's both part of the primary and also part of the tertiary or service part of the economy. So let's talk a little bit about agriculture, just to define some stuff. There are different types of agriculture in the world. There is subsistence agriculture. That's primarily where you grow it for household use. You grow food to eat the food. And this is practiced in many parts of the world: Latin America, Africa, Asia, where farming is done primarily to eat the products that are grown. On the other hand, there is also commercial agriculture. This is a large-scale, for-profit type of agriculture. And this is primarily what we practice in California, that you have like if you have a vineyard or an almond orchard, people are not growing those almonds to necessarily eat them all. They're growing them to sell and make a profit. And another term for this type of commercial agriculture is agribusiness. So it's part of the primary sector, but we should also recognize that it involves a lot of technology. In fact, in some ways, farming is somewhat like factory work in places like California. A couple of notes about agriculture in California. We're going to talk about it more extensively, but the two main things I want to highlight is that California is the leading agricultural state in the United States. And we have a very diverse type of agriculture, and we'll look at some illustrations of that coming up. However, California is home to other primary industries as well. In addition to agriculture, there's forestry. California has significant forest resources, second to Oregon. Most of that concentrated up near Oregon in the northern part of the state, where you have cooler temperatures, wetter climate, and more forested areas. Fisheries is another. There is some products like abalone, where California is the main harvester of certain types of fish. There is salmon and other fishing resources as well. And even recreational fishing, that can be included in this as well. Ecotourism, which is both service and also a primary, because it involves things from nature, and millions of people come each year to California to visit our public lands, places like Yosemite National Park and other places. And lastly, mining and energy. So oil and gas are, well, gold, mining gold has been important in the past, as we've discussed. Currently, the main mining done in California is oil and gas production. And there's various amounts of oil and gas around California, but the large deposits of oil and gas are primarily in the southern San Joaquin Valley, in Kern County especially, and in the Los Angeles Basin. Here's a closer view of the southern San Joaquin Valley. So this area west of Bakersfield has a really high concentration of oil wells and is probably the biggest oil production area of the state. And then all around the area of Bakersfield, and then all the way up to the Coalinga in southwestern Fresno County, you have different levels of oil production. But these are really the big hot spots of oil production in California. And there's also some significant ones in the Los Angeles basin as well. And so, you know, it's not evenly distributed around California, but California, while it's not the major oil and gas producer in the United States, it is a significant one.